Welcome to the Global Connection, a Tel Aviv University podcast. Journey with us as we discover how TAU's academic community and friends are engaging with and helping to shape this ever-changing world. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Global Connection. I'm your host, Dr. Anna Sujecki, and I am delighted to have in the studio with me today Professor Justin Cammy, who is chair of both the program in World Literatures and the program in Jewish Studies at Smith College in the United States. He is a literary and cultural historian specializing in Yiddish and happens to be joining me today as he is also the on-site summer program director for the Naomi Prawer Kadar International Yiddish Summer Program. And he's also on the academic advisory board of the Jonah Goldrich Center for Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture. And both the Yiddish program and the center are here at Tel Aviv University. So welcome to the studio. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Although I'm a graduate of the Hebrew University one-year program,
Ooh,
I know I shouldn't say that, but
okay.
I've been affiliated with Tel Aviv University now, I think, for 14 or 15 years. So it's really great to be here with you.
Well, in truth, I think they do get on pretty well.
I would hope so.
Yeah. So it's okay. Well, I approve of that. So I wanted to sort of start by going a little bit back into your own academic journey. So I know that you did your PhD at Harvard and you focus on Yiddish studies as well as modern Jewish literature. So can you tell me a little bit about what drew you to focus on that? And
Well, we should probably tell our audience that we're both Canadian.
To
start off with, because I think there's a story that before I get to the United States and that graduate work, I think that the relationship between Yiddish in major centers like New York and what Yiddish was in places like Montreal or Winnipeg, for instance, in Canada was quite different, given the differences between those countries. So I actually was drawn to Yiddish first at McGill during my undergraduate studies when I took a course just on general modern Jewish literature, and there was a Yiddish component to that, and then took a seminar before I graduated. And then decided to continue. But for me, I was majoring in political science and Middle East studies, and I was very engaged with that work. And then suddenly the experience of reading these texts, which contained everything within them, history, psychology, sociology, anthropology, religion, really spoke to me. It sort of changed the course. It's sort of an example of how in the humanities, if you stretch beyond your immediate boundaries, you can really be awakened to new and exciting things. Right. And that then sort of drew me into a field that at the time felt underserved and perhaps not getting the attention it needed. Nowadays, Yiddish studies is very hot. And there's a lot of young students and a lot of scholars who are entering into the field or who recognize the importance of the field. But in those days, it was still rather small. There was a long history of Yiddish studies going back at least a century, if not more. And there were certainly very well and esteemed scholars of Yiddish studies. And it seemed like a place where I could make my mark. I always compared it in terms of sort of thinking what type of literature you want to study. Did I really want to, write the 10,000th PhD on Shakespeare or on Faulkner or on a well-known writer, or did I want to write the first doctorate on some Yiddish writer who was just as deserving and just as sort of important for his audience, for his readership, and I think also for our own. So that was really exciting for me as a young scholar, to be in a field that where almost everything still needed to be done. We didn't have biographies of the major writers. We didn't have histories of the major groups. We didn't have studies of some of the major exciting movements. So this was...
So it was a really small, at the time, professional community in the literary Yiddish studies field. Do you feel like it's changed at all?
I think it's changed in the sense that it's so much more theoretically sophisticated. That is, it's much more in conversation with broader theoretical trends in the humanities and especially in literary and cultural studies than perhaps it was when I started. And that can be a really great thing. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all. I still think that sort of studying a text and knowing what you think about it without the intervention of these things is important. But yeah, I think it's really exciting to bring Yiddish into conversation with the latest trends in what other people are doing in these fields, whether it be translation studies or whether it be the medical humanities or whether it be the environmental humanities. Yiddish has something to say, and Yiddish literature has something to say about all these things, in addition to what it has to say about Jewish experience over the past 1,000 years. So one can sort of consistent, as they say, turn it over and over, and all is contained within it. And I think one can say that even about secular Yiddish literature, and perhaps even more so.
Okay. Well, you've done a really nice job of broadening out the applicability of studying Yiddish literature. So I think I'm going to follow up with a really broad question.
Sure.
Which for our listeners, if you could even talk about just like the history of the language and its evolution a little bit, especially as a transcultural language. There's so many different Yiddish communities around the world, and there's a history and a present to that. So yeah, if you could let us know more generally about Yiddish a bit.
So a lot of people think that Yiddish is a relatively new language. And in fact, Yiddish extends back at least 1,000 years. So by my measure, that's not young. That's fairly well established. Our linguists have determined, and most linguists agree, that it sort of grew up in the Rhinelands of West Central Europe, which might be something of an intervention in terms of popular understanding of Yiddish as an Eastern European language. That is, we know that Jewish languages migrate with the Jews, right? They don't exist on their own. So when the Jews migrate from the German lands to the East, that's when Yiddish really becomes an East European language. And that's when it picks up its Slavic element. And then when the Jews leave Eastern Europe and then move to the Americas, whether that be the United States and the huge immigration, or to Canada, or to Mexico, or to Cuba, or to South America, or to South Africa, or to Australia, that's where we have this sort of broadening of the diasporic nature of what had always been considered one of many diasporic Jewish languages. So when asking about sort of the broad questions about what Yiddish is and where it comes from, I think there's a couple of things we can think about. One is, why do Jews develop diasporic languages of their own? That is, why do they not just borrow the language of the peoples among whom they live? And why do they write in aleph-bes? Why do they move, from right to left instead of reading, if that's the case, from left to right in other contexts? And Yiddish is one of many diasporic languages that Jews develop. So, of course, we have the classical Hebrew, and we have Aramaic, and we have Rabbinic Hebrew, but we also have Judeo-German, Yiddish. We have Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, we have Judeo-Arabic, we have Judeo-Persian, we have Judeo-Turkish, and the list goes on and on. So this is one of many languages that Jews develop in order to be able to talk to themselves, to understand themselves, to develop their own curricula, perhaps not to be understood by others at other moments, perhaps to open up and bring other ideas into the Jewish world. That's one way of thinking about the development of Yiddish. But as we go on and think about its long history, there's a lot of assumptions that people make about Yiddish. So nowadays, in the early 21st century, perhaps most listeners would think of Yiddish as a language of radicalism, a language of progressive politics, a language of Jewish humanism, a language of perhaps anti-statehood, perhaps even a language that is anti-national, perhaps a language that is secular. And all those things may be true of Yiddish at certain points in its history, especially more recent history. But in fact, for most of its 1,000-year history, Yiddish was the language of what one of the great linguists of Yiddish, Max Weinreich, called derech hashas. That is, Yiddish is the language of a very traditional Jewish community, the language of the Jewish masses. And it's only with the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah in Yiddish, the Haskalah in Hebrew, that there are certain streams of the Haskalah that start to think about Yiddish as a way of Europeanizing, modernizing, and perhaps even secularizing the Jewish people. And it sort of gets away from them. The more they write in Yiddish to try to show the Jews how backwards they are, the more the masses want more Yiddish, want more Yiddish literature.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, for myself, I'm not learning Yiddish right now, but I'm learning Hebrew.
There's always time, right?
There's always time. There's the time. It could be the next one. But for me, whenever I enter into a new language, it really feels like I'm entering into a bit of a new world, right? When you're thinking about the etymology of the different words, when you're thinking about the logic of that language, I feel like you've maybe partly even answered this question already, just in terms of the sheer complexity and evolution in different ways of Yiddish. But if you were to say that Yiddish creates sort of a world or understanding of the world as a language, how would you describe that world?
Such a tough question. Maybe we should go back to the linguistic elements first. So oftentimes Yiddish has been, those who oppose Yiddish for various reasons oftentimes talk about Yiddish as a jargon, as not a real language. And oftentimes they're comparing that through European romantic contexts to this idea of pure languages, that there are somehow pure languages and impure languages, and that Yiddish is an impure language. Well, of course, we know that one of the most impure, if we even use those terms, which don't mean anything, is English. Right? There's no such thing as a pure or an impure language, or a beautiful or a less beautiful language. But Yiddish, in terms of its grammar, is close to 70% Germanic. So it's Germanic in terms of vocabulary and grammar, about 20% Slavic, depending on where it is. And then, you have the rest of the elements are Lashon Kodesh, so Hebrew, Aramaic, that give it its sort of Jewish flavor and context and ability to talk about those issues that are only, related to Jewish experience. So when we think of Yiddish as sort of a component that brings in those three worlds, right? The Slavic, the Germanic, and also the Semitic in terms of language families, we already see that there's something quite interesting going on there. The other issue about Yiddish that goes to the heart of your question is that for many centuries, Yiddish was, in terms of a language hierarchy, Yiddish was gendered and was oftentimes seen gendered as female, as woman, because there was a sense that somehow Hebrew, and especially Aramaic, the language of the study house, of the yeshiva, was the sort of masculine,
right?
and that was the language of intellectualism, that was the language of study, that was the language of Torah, and Yiddish was the language of the domestic sphere, or the everyday sphere, what we would call today, the secular sphere. But of course, that word didn't exist at the time. So it took Yiddish centuries to sort of get away from the idea that somehow it shouldn't or couldn't be taken seriously, that somehow it was only for ideas that didn't matter or experiences that didn't matter. But what this means is that over the centuries, that there's something paradoxical and really exciting about it, that as the more it was seen, especially by men, especially by male intellectuals in the Haskalah, as somehow feminine, the more it developed an audience, especially an audience of woman readers. So it's really one of the most amazing things about Yiddish is that we can see that as it appeals to women readers over the century, they become one of the bases for this literature that then eventually, becomes mass read. We know that that's not true. That's only a myth, right? Of course, everyone was reading Yiddish at the time, even those who said it was only
a woman's language.
Only a woman's language.
Right.
And even the name Yiddish that we use today for this language, up until the very late 19th century, that wasn't used. There were writers. The most famous Yiddish writer of all time, Sholem Aleichem, is writing in the 1880s to other writers, and he's referring to the language that he's writing in as jargon. So it takes time for Yiddish, which also means Jewish,
right,
to become concretized. And there are other names for the same language, whether that be Mamaloshen, right, the mother tongue, whether that be Judeo-German, which is very scholarly, whether that be Teich or Weiberteich, which also deals with the womanly aspect, whether that be Loshen Ashkenaz, the language of Ashkenaz. So even the name of Yiddish, or the various names of Yiddish over time, tell us a little bit about the history, the attitudes, and certain arrogance that was imposed upon sort of where Yiddish stood within the larger family of languages that Jews could or would or should speak.
And I feel like it probably can be said about every language is you need to think about languages in the context of other languages, but with Yiddish especially so. And you've even talked about this sort of the masculine versus feminine domain of Hebrew and Aramaic versus Yiddish. So given we're here in Israel and given Hebrew is the primary language here, I'm curious, what does Yiddish mean in Israel?
So this is this is not a new, but a newish, a hot question. There's a lot of scholarship now coming out about the experience of Yiddish, not first in the Yishuv and then in the post-8 years, and how Yiddish was treated. So, but let me go back even further than that. So I would say that when we think of the late 19th and especially early 20th century, in Hebrew, it's oftentimes spoken about as the period of Riv HaLashonot, the fight between languages, right? And those languages were Hebrew and Yiddish. And there was assumption that Hebrew was related to Zionism and Yiddish was related to diasporism. Of course, we know that there was a lot of Zionist work that was being carried out in Yiddish, and there was a lot of diasporic work that was being carried out in Hebrew. But people don't always want to, listen to reality. They have these constructs in their imagination. We also know that most Yiddish writers were also fluent Yiddish speakers. Most Hebrew writers were fluent Yiddish speakers and fluent Yiddish writers. And we have many writers who wrote in both languages interchangeably. We also know that many scholars early on said that this idea of separating the two languages would be like looking at the world or Jewish experience through only one eye. That is, you can do that, right? Of course, you can see with only one eye, but your perception is distorted. And that somehow, if you really want to be a scholar of the modern Jewish experience, whether that be by looking at historical sources or literary sources, you actually need both languages. That to study only Hebrew literature and to say I'm not interested in anything that happened in Yiddish literature, or to say I'm only interested in Yiddish literature but know nothing about the development of Hebrew literature, in a way, you're not really talking about the interaction that was so close among these languages and continues to be so close. And in fact, the building of modern contemporary Israeli Hebrew owes a lot to Yiddish expressions and to the Yiddish speakers who were engaged with that.
Right.
Today, I think that the perceptions are always in movement, right? So nowadays, when people hear about Yiddish, not only in Israel, even in the United States with my students, oftentimes the first perception is that Yiddish is old. They forget about when Yiddish was young, or that Yiddish is victimized, or that Yiddish was murdered, or that Yiddish is only the domain of the religious. Right? And of course, all of these things may have certain truths, kernels of truths in them, but in terms of the reality, it's so much more complex. There are young people who are at the democratic protests nowadays taking in Israel who are doing their protesting in Yiddish. And so I think that as Israeli society matures, as we reach a different moment in the history of Zionist discourse, in the same way that in the United States, up until the late 1960s, or in Canada, where we grew up, you could teach American or Canadian literature without including a woman, without including Black writers, without including Native, Indigenous writers, without including anything that didn't seem at the time canonical, mainstream. Just like you could do that, you can't teach that way anymore.
No.
Students would revolt, and rightfully so. And I think in the same way we're going to see that, and we are seeing that in Israel, that at a certain point, now that the hegemony of Hebrew is, a fait accompli, no one is challenging Hebrew, we are starting to see the children and especially the grandchildren of those immigrant generations saying, wait a second, what about the Yiddish that we spoke? What about the Arabic that was lost? What about the Persian that was lost? What about the Spanish and Ladino that was lost? And I think that there's a growing interest in Israel now that Hebrew is so secure to sort of to destabilize Hebrew and recognize that this country has a significant number of multilingual, multiliterary traditions that need to be recuperated. So in the Yiddish summer program that I'm involved in right now, one of the things that I've been joking about, but not totally joking, seriously, is developing, a T-shirt to match many of the T-shirts that we see on the streets these days that say that there can be no democracy without Yiddish. Now, someone listening might say, I don't really understand what that means. There can be no democracy without Yiddish. Well, they say on these t-shirts, there can be no healthcare without democracy. There can be no academia without democracy. But I actually think that there can be no democracy without respect for multiculturalism. And Yiddish can become a symbol for that multiculturalism. That is, if you want to be a country that is empathetic to difference, right? And that is not hegemonic in the way it understands its own cultural production, and that allows different streams to be in conversation or even in competition with one another, then democracy relies on Yiddish and Arabic and all these other linguistic traditions, in addition, of course, to the wonderful culture that is Hebrew culture, in order to retain its flexibility, its dynamism, its openness to the world. To me, that's what that type of T-shirt would represent if it existed.
Okay. Well, maybe it's not too difficult.
One day we'll make a T-shirt.
I don't know. But you bring up a really great point, and I think in your research, you do focus now a bit more recently on the cultural resurgence and reclamation of Yiddish. And from my understanding, partly the summer program, there's more and more interest in it. And so you're seeing more people becoming engaged with the Yiddish language. And I've read a bit of your work where you talk about, in relation to English literature too, a sort of resurgence and reclamation of Yiddish. For so long, its representation in English literature has been related to loss. And now there's sort of this shift, and it's about reclaiming the language. So yeah, can you talk about that a little bit more in terms of literature or just in general? Are you really seeing that?
I'm seeing it, but I also try to practice it in sort of a very conscious meta pedagogy. Okay. So even in my own courses, I just published a big translation with McGill Queen's University Press of a Holocaust memoir. But now my next project is going to be not about the Churban, not about Shoah, not about loss, but about Yiddish at its peak of production, at its peak of dynamism. And I do the same thing with my courses. For every course that I teach on the Holocaust, I'll teach 2 courses on sort of Jews creating their own culture in order to not skew the way we think either of Yiddish or we think of Jewish experience. But students are really drawn to Yiddish, and I think for a variety of reasons, and we have to be honest about that as scholars. Some people are drawn to Yiddish initially because it's the anti-Hebrew, or they see it as the anti-Hebrew. That is, if you're a young diasporist, or if you're opposed to certain politics, maybe you'll find your address in Yiddish. There's another whole stream recently of people who are drawn to Yiddish who are very interested in feminist and queer theory, and then somehow see in Yiddish, because of its long history of being gendered, a home for themselves that is in Jewish culture, but they can claim and shape as their own. Some will come to Yiddish because they see in it an integrative possibility for reconnecting different chapters of Jewish history that were broken quite radically and oftentimes violently, and see it as the vehicle through which to rethread the sort of fabric that had been torn apart. Others will come into Yiddish because they recognize that Yiddish is not dead. It's not even dying. In fact, Yiddish is growing in numbers. It may not be the language that it was in 1939, but no language and no people and no culture is the same language that it was almost 100 years ago, right? So there are children being born into Yiddish today. It's true that many of them who are being born into Yiddish are in ultra-Orthodox communities. So if you want to have a relationship with those ultra-Orthodox communities and to understand what's going on there, Yiddish can be a vehicle for that. Okay. Others will say, no, Yiddish is in a post-vernacular stage. That is, it's much more symbolic as opposed to vernacular in terms of being used. That is, Yiddish represents a symbol. Yiddish is an object of desire. Yiddish has become a fetish. So there's so many different avenues through which someone can enter the field of Yiddish and find their home there. And I think for the reasons that we talked about earlier, it's inconceivable now that, and this is obviously not only appropriate to Jews, especially for non-Jews. The most exciting things in the field, I think, are the growing number of students, especially from Germany and countries in Eastern Europe, who are turning to Yiddish because they recognize that you cannot do Polish studies when at one point, a third of your country was Yiddish speaking. If you want to be a historian of Poland and you want to write about certain questions, you need Yiddish, right? If you want to be a scholar of the Ukraine and you want to study multicultural literatures of Ukraine, you're going to need Yiddish. If you want to study certain linguistic realities of contemporary German, you're going to have to study Middle High German and Middle High Yiddish and Old Yiddish. There's all of these reasons that people would be drawn to Yiddish, apart from sort of the idea that it's, this language that perhaps they heard or have a relationship with through grandparents that was never passed down to them.
Okay, that's a great point. With the international summer program in Yiddish, are you seeing that then? Do you really have people coming from all different backgrounds to learn the language?
Absolutely. So we have students of different national and religious backgrounds. We have a whole cohort of students with us from the country of Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. This year we have students from 14 countries. United States, Sweden, Cyprus, Georgia, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and the list could go on. There's no Canadian this year.
No Canadian.
I wave the flag for Canada, but this year there's no Canadian. We also, of course, have this year students from Latin America as well. And we have one from Argentina, representing the strong history of Yiddish in Buenos Aires. So I see a lot of students coming, and I think this is part of the broader project of the Goldrich Institute under which the program runs. So the director of that institute, Dr. Hannah Pauline Galai, is a member of the literature department here, and she is the director of the institute and has generously allowed me to come in and help out and help her run the program during the summer. But really, the program itself the summer Yiddish language program is part of a broader effort to make sure that Yiddish is part of the educational system and of higher education studies here in Israel. And the summer program, the Naomi, Prof, Kadar International Summer Program, I've been with them since 14 years. It was founded even before that by Professor Hannah Wirth-Nesher here, who was an Americanist and professor of Ram Noverstern of the Hebrew University, and has always sought to bring Israeli students from different universities in Israel together with students from abroad. And I think that's really a unique program. There are other Yiddish programs in the world that are distinguished as well, but our program puts those two groups in conversation. So the Israeli scholars who are studying Yiddish here at an Israeli university with students who perhaps are studying Yiddish in Eastern Europe and engage with it in a different way, and with students who are coming at it from America whose experiences are that of sort of immigrant socialist activists who then lost languages.
Right.
And all of those students together in a classroom produce a really neat and I think exciting environment. And the reason I keep coming back summer after summer is because I can't imagine Israeli universities not having a Yiddish summer program for Israeli students. I mean, I think that it's critical for the state. And I know this isn't a state program, but in my own mind, it does have symbolic value. And when our students walk around the streets of Tel Aviv carrying a bag that says that they're studying in this Yiddish program, people ask them, you came to Israel to study Yiddish? Why are you studying Yiddish? I didn't know that there was a program in Yiddish. What drew you to it? It's also a conversation starter, and it allows people, even encourages people, forces people to recognize the presence of Yiddish in Israel, the long history of it. We have multiple Yiddish institutions that exist right here in Tel Aviv. We just took our students last Friday on a 6-hour tour in the heat to Yiddish destinations in the north that Yiddish writers wrote about at the turn of the century, all the way up through 1948. There's exciting Yiddish literary sites here in Israel. One doesn't only have to go to Poland, or to Ukraine, or to New York, or to South America. There's a long history here, and it's up to us to help shape and present that for students. So this becomes sort of one of the joys of coming from abroad and getting to sort of meet students who are unlike the students I get to teach on a daily basis.
Do you have a highlight of your time here so far with the Yiddish program, summer Yiddish program?
Well, the tour to the north with one of our teachers, who also is a tour guide, was great. We're going to Beit Ariela, to the Gnazim archive, to look at their Yiddish collection. We've had several concerts, including a concert with Miriam Tukan, who's a well-known Israeli singer, and she sang songs in Arabic and in Hebrew and in Yiddish. And also one of our own students, Leah Kalish, another professional singer, presented at that same concert. So we try to complement the morning learning of Yiddish language at all different levels. We begin at the very beginners and go all the way to an advanced seminar with a rich afternoon cultural component. So we'll have lectures and conversation classes and opportunities to go to movies and opportunities to go out. Just yesterday, students went on a 2-hour walking tour in Yiddish of Yiddish sites in Tel Aviv. And even that, I think, more than for the students who are getting a lot out of it, what's so interesting, I think, is looking at the people, looking at them doing the tour in Yiddish.
Right.
These Israelis going, what are these students doing, speaking Yiddish out in the street? To me, it's also making a statement. It's
doing something really interesting.
Yeah, it's engaging in cultural work. The other night, one of the highlights was one of the greatest of Yiddish poets and writers who founded one of the most prestigious journals in Yiddish studies. We went to his house where he used to live, met his daughter. And we had students, 30 students standing outside of the entrance, looking at the plaque on the building wall, singing songs, reading his poetry, meeting with his daughter. As people are entering and exiting the same building in which he lived and worked, perhaps never having read him because he was a Yiddish writer and not a Hebrew writer, and sort of pausing curiously, why are all these students here?
Right.
Why are they not speaking in Hebrew?
Right.
What are they reading?
Right.
I mean, this aspect of movement of Yiddish as an afterthought or Yiddish as a curiosity to Yiddish as something that's deeply rooted and substantial, I think is part of the work that the program is doing.
Okay. Well, I have to say it sounds like an amazing program on so many different levels. So, Justin, I have to thank you for being here today and telling me a bit more about it and talking about the language Yiddish with me.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.